A few weeks ago, I was introduced to Jet Set Radio. It was a completely new experience full of new gameplay, new artwork, and my favorite thing of all time, new sounds. Now, I'm no stranger to hip-hop, and neither is the games industry, but I'd never heard this game before now. It sounds so refreshing, so unique, and so sampled. Since discovering the series, I've been paying more and more attention to sampling in games, and like music in the real world, it's everywhere. From Pokemon, MVC, The World Ends With You, and even the Souls games have it. Yeah, it's pretty big, and it's only getting bigger with time. So with a brand new entry apparently on the horizon, and this new realization, let's look into sampling. What it is, how it works, and why it's so common. So, if you would, Kay, play us out, and let's talk about
Jet Set Radio!
Let's get scratching.
Now, we're talking about sampling today, and let me tell you, it's a real doozy. It's one of those things that's really easy to describe, but hard to get into, and I'm definitely not an expert on it, so I reached out to one. This is Dr. Robert Esler. He's a professional percussionist, electronic musician, and resident Jingle Bells player. He's an expert on sound design, both in the real world and video game music, so I'm glad to sit down with him and talk about this.
Alright, so sampling, on its most basic level, I would say, is where if you're a musician, you take part of another person's recording and use that in your own original work. But before we started doing that, I'll say sampling was actually just recording anything and then recontextualizing it in a musical piece. And it starts out like in the 1940s when the very first tape experiments, in fact, some people were doing it with wire, like metal wire, just making short recordings, 15 seconds long, and then playing around with those tapes or wires in their studios and playing them forwards, backwards, whatever they could do. And it became kind of this little niche musical experiment.
Now, I know what you just heard is a lot, so let's break this down with an example. Drum roll, please! Thank you. Basically, sampling is using any external recording in your mix. So, let's say I'm using this line from Marvel vs. Capcom 3.
You're not gonna go out like that, are you?
With certain permission, you can use them word for word, say, in time with the backing track.
You're not gonna go out like that, are you?
But that's not the only way you can sample something. You can make changes to the original audio that makes it unique, such as pitching the track up or down.
You're not gonna go out like that, are you?
Or slowing it down. Or you can even cut up the audio and make your own sound.
You're not gonna go out.
As you can see, it's not only one of the most diverse types of sound design around, but it even has its own variety of techniques that accompany it. However, is there a specific sound that sampling has to be? And what makes the sound of sampling unique?
I would say, there's not necessarily a single sound of what sampling is. It just depends on what area of music you are. I would say the most common use of sampling would be like pop music, electronic dance music, hip hop, that kind of area. But, sampling can take place in the most unusual of places. And the main thing is I would say is that either you have basically two goals when you sample something in a musical context. One is that people recognize it and that has some sort of meaning to your music. The other is that people don't recognize it and subsequently it has meaning only to you. And maybe there's kind of a middle area where maybe only a very select few people recognize it, but pretty much nobody does. And so that, like a good example of that would be, I think, Missy Elliott's song, I think it's called Clear Control, where she samples Model 500's 1986-87 song, Clear.
Music make you lose control. Music make you lose control.
It was like a Detroit techno piece that I don't think anyone would know just, from their musical experience. But when Missy Elliott samples it, no, I don't think anybody knew where it was from. except for maybe those that were really diehard techno fans. So that's kind of like an in-between case, but you have a lot of cases where people do know where the sample comes from.
And this concept stretches into video games too. Remember this Jim from Third Strike?
Let's go. To the Batmobile. Let's go.
Bet you're gonna be thinking about your meter differently now, huh? But does sampling go further? Can, say, reusing or reworking old assets be sampling?
Well, that's kind of like definitely falls into the category because you're self-referencing. I mean, it's you know your fans know these sounds, and subsequently they're being referenced again because the fans are familiar with them and know where they come from, and there's a history there, there's a lineage there, and that's kind of important actually to the developers to have that connection between iterations of games. I mean, look at Final Fantasy. Like you mentioned, there's just new music in each game, but some of it overlaps. You hear it again. Some of it's based on stories and characters, and so this is important to fans to hear this.
I think one of my favorite examples of this is what The World Ends With You does. You see, despite only having 2 games, its main song Twister has actually been remixed around 5 times. Twice for the original game at Neo, once for the anime, and 2 more times for Kingdom Hearts. And every single time, something is added, or something's retooled from what came before. Take a listen and you'll see what I mean. You hear the similarity? I never thought I'd bring up anything from this stupid mobile game. Yet here we are. Honestly, this is one of the coolest things to me, and I wish other studios did something similar with their properties. But there's no one on this earth who recycles their assets like FromSoft does. There's way too many examples to list all of them, but here's one most Bloodborne players might recognize. Do you hear it? It's the same cry the developers used for the crows, recycled all the way back from Dark Souls 1. But what makes sampling legal? Surely there has to be some hoops to go through to use a sound that isn't yours. Let's find out how and why sampling is as legal and accessible as it is.
Sampling has to come from the direct recording of the original. And so legally speaking, that can be covered under multiple licenses. So like there's something called mechanical license, which is the recording or the record label would have ownership over the actual recording. And then there's the other license that the songwriter would have, which I forget the name, compulsory license, I think it's called. And it's basically where the songwriter has ownership over the musical content, right? So when you sample it, and if you do it legally, well, if you try to get it licensed, I should say, then you have to get permission from both entities. Now, if you're writing a new piece of music and you're either quoting something or rearranging something, that's a slightly different concept. Sometimes it's called arrangement. So that's typically something you would license from the songwriter, and to get an arrangement license, and then you can make your own arrangement of like a Final Fantasy tune. Or you can sometimes just, I mean, no other better word than to steal it, which is what a lot of composers do, is they just steal stuff, and most people don't really even notice.
When it comes to quoting something, think of it like licks in jazz. If you hear something you like in a track, let's say Dolphin Shoals, there's no one stopping you from learning how to play it and using it as a reference, as long as you don't claim that it's yours while you play it on stage. That said though, as you can see, there's a whole lot of gray area when it comes to this stuff, which brings us to the biggest piece of this.
I'll say, like anytime anyone gives legal advice, you have to say that this is not legal advice. So that's what I'm officially saying, that I'm not giving legal advice. But technically speaking, sampling falls under fair use. So the only problem is that it's how it's done. So context is everything. And context can only be, or the usage can only be really challenged legally in court. So this is where we see people who can sample, their entire catalog can be just based on sampling. and never enter the court of law. And then those that have sampled very, very little or very small bits of something and be sued to bankruptcy. And it all depends on the context of how the sample was being used.
Essentially, different types of sampling have different types of licensing you need to have. Think of it like you're using quotes in an essay. I could easily slap this quote from Dr. Esler on a paper, without credit, or even take credit myself for it. But just like plagiarizing an essay, blatantly stealing another person's music without credit can have some pretty serious consequences. And it's usually not just a slap on the wrist or a bad grade. It's typically a lawsuit or two. However, like Dr. Esler mentioned, a lot of sampling falls under fair use. Just like paraphrasing an essay, using a sample in an original context falls under fair use. Works protected under fair use are usually transformative in nature, meaning they're used in a way that is unique, educational, entertaining, or other ways that are original. It's one of the reasons why Let's Plays, game reviews, and even this show is allowed on YouTube. And similar logic applies to sampling. Going back to our quote example, it'd be like using this quote to highlight an original idea. Now there's exceptions of course, and with them other licenses, but for the most part, unless you're plagiarizing or using a full uninterrupted beat in your music, you're probably gonna be fine. And that's the basics on sampling, from its origins all the way through to the legal side of it, just in time to listen to something new. It really is one of the most universal pieces of music making, and I'm glad to be able to share it with you. It's one of my favorite things to think about, so next time you boot up your favorite game, look around and smell the sampling in it. Thank you for watching. I want to give a huge thank you to Dr. Esler for working with me on this episode. It was such a great experience to be able to tap someone like this for information, and this episode wouldn't have been the same without him. There's so much to talk about when it comes to sampling. I haven't even mentioned fan games, remixed things, and so many more different things that touch base with this stuff. That's how diverse it is. I'll be sure to cover them in other episodes though. As always, my sources are going to be down below, so be sure to check them out. Be sure to like and subscribe if you want to see more Chiptunes. It really goes to support the channel. I love making these, and it looks like I'll be pumping out new episodes every month or so. Let me know what the first game you remember hearing sampling in was. Mine's gotta be Colress's themes with the numbers counting down. That was such a good theme, and so was the rest of that game's music. Anyway, that's enough from me. Colress, take him away.